You stand in the great plaza of Tenochtitlan. The vast space shimmers under the morning sun. Banners flutter in the air. Drums pound like thunder rolling through mountains. The smell of blood and burning copal thickens as thousands gather, their voices hushed, awaiting the terrible spectacle. A victim is dragged forward, stripped naked. His skin glistens with sweat, muscles trembling under the grip of masked priests. Obsidian blades flash black as night, yet sharp as lightning. They cut deep, peeling skin from flesh, and the crowd erupts, half in horror, half in ecstasy, as he collapses lifeless. But the ritual does not end there. Another priest steps forward, calm and deliberate, moving as if in trance. He lifts the dripping skin like a robe, the flesh still steaming in the cool air, and slowly, reverently, he pulls it on before the multitude. The flayed skin hangs loosely, raw and wet, clinging to his face, chest and arms, as if refusing to let go. Blood drips steadily to the stone below, pattering like rain on sacred ground. The crowd screams, not in disgust, but in ecstasy, believing they have witnessed transformation. This was Tlacaxipehualiztli, the festival of the flayed men. For 20 days, the priests wore human skins, walking among the people as embodiments of gods. To the Aztecs, this was not cruelty, but the purest act of divine renewal, a theatre of blood that preserved cosmic balance. By the way, I'd love to know where you're listening from. It's always moving to see this community gathering from so many places, all united by curiosity of shocking and bizarre truths. And if you'd like more of these stories that remind us how lucky we are compared to humans of the past, please take a moment to subscribe and like. Now back to the story. The god-honoured was Xipe Totec, our lord, the flayed one. He embodied new life through death, like seeds breaking husks, like maize sprouting from shells, like butterflies emerging from cocoons. To wear the skin was to embody rebirth, to show that life only rises when death is shed. Wearing skin was sacred theatre. The priest was no longer a man. He became the god incarnate. Children touched the flayed flesh, believing its rotting warmth carried power, a blessing of fertility, rebirth, and continuity. What we see as horror, they saw as renewal. But this was only one festival. The Aztec calendar spun endlessly with blood. Every month another god demanded sacrifice. Every season, fresh bodies offered on stone. Death was never absence, but constant presence, woven into the heartbeat of empire, a rhythm that guided crops, war, and life. The festival of Toxcatl revealed another devotion. A young man chosen, he lived for 1 year as Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. He walked the city with flutes, jewels, flowers, adored as the god himself, a living idol surrounded by reverence, his every step echoing divinity. But his fate was sealed before it began. When the festival ended, he climbed the temple steps. Crowds cheered and wailed in equal measure. He lay across stone as priests held him firm. Obsidian blades opened his chest wide, and his still-beating heart was lifted high, a final offering to the sky. The heart was raised skyward, pulsing still. Blood sprayed across the stone altar, painting steps in crimson rivulets. Drums thundered, conch shells screamed, flutes wailed like souls departing. The body, stripped of its essence, was hurled down to the masses below. Cannibalism followed sacrifice, not as indulgence but sacred feast. The flesh was cooked into stews served at noble banquets, shared among warriors as holy communion. In every bite they believed divine power entered, binding human life to the eternal gods. Spanish chronicles confirm these acts. Bernal Diaz wrote of Tzompantli skull racks, thousands of heads bleaching in the sun, temples black with clotted blood, air thick with rot and incense. Conquistadors recoiled in horror, yet could not deny the order within the chaos. Archaeology later proved the stories true. At Templo Mayor, skull racks were uncovered, circular towers of human crania mortared together, a grim architecture of devotion. What Europeans thought exaggeration, was carved into bone itself, truth rising unbroken from the soil of Mexico. Children, too, were offered. Their tears were sacred, believed to summon rains from Tlaloc, Lord of Water. Priests sometimes frightened them deliberately, forcing cries before the knife, ensuring the god received offerings, not only of flesh but of sorrow. Women's deaths carried symbolism as well. Some drowned in sacred lakes, others burned alive, their ashes scattered across fields. Decapitations honoured goddesses of fertility, transforming suffering into renewal, binding feminine power with cycles of earth. Every method carried meaning. Hearts fed the sun, blood nourished the soil, skins renewed, fertility bones became tools or displays. Death was never waste. It was transaction, a cosmic economy balancing gods and men. Wars themselves became harvests. The flower wars were fought not for land, but for bodies. Armies clashed under banners, seeking captives to bind and bleed. Each prisoner was currency, a coin of flesh spent on altars. Numbers stagger the mind. Spanish witnesses claim tens of thousands died in a single festival. Exaggeration or not, archaeology revealed mass pits, hundreds buried together, the truth between record and soil undeniable. The Tzompantli skull rack stood as proof. Rows of heads drilled and mounted, mortared into great towers. Death became monument, a display of piety and terror, the faces of sacrifice staring eternally, at city and sky alike. Cannibalism was restricted, never common. Only nobles and warriors partook. Human flesh was mixed with maize, boiled into ritual stews, consumed as communion. It was not hunger, but holiness, a meal of gods shared among men. To the Aztecs it was honour. A victim whose flesh was eaten became divine sustenance. Their body carried essence into empire, their spirit bound forever. To the cycle of gods, it was death, yes, but also transformation eternal. The Spaniards were horrified. Cortés wrote of temples drenched in gore, walls black, and stinking skull towers glaring under sun. He claimed thousands of heads, a vision enough to haunt him forever, yet also a tool for conquest. They weaponized horror as justification. By portraying Mexica rites as monstrous, they claimed divine right to destroy them. Ending sacrifice became moral armour, even as their own hands tortured, burned heretics, and spilled blood in the name of their god. Yet beneath condemnation was fascination. They saw order in rituals, precision in cuts, ceremony in chants. It was not chaos but system, a city organised by sacrifice, its grandeur inseparable from terror. Priests prepared with strict devotion. They fasted from pleasures, bathed in cold water, and smeared their bodies with ash. Only purity allowed them to cut, to channel gods through knives, to carry the burden of blood. Obsidian knives were sharp and thin, edges glistening like dark mirrors. They could split flesh in a stroke or open a chest in moments, lift a beating heart intact. Tools of both artistry and terror, the true engines of worship. Robes reflected gods themselves. Some priests wrapped in jaguar skins, others adorned with feathers, still others cloaked in flayed human hides. Costumes transformed men into deities, their every movement sacred, their every gesture watched by thousands. Templo Mayor rose over Tenochtitlan like a man-made mountain, each layer set upon the last. Every enlargement began with offerings and ended in blood. Stones were placed with prayers, foundations packed with bones. Memory hardened into architecture, history mortared with sacrifice and smoke. 2 shrines crowned the summit, Cuauhxicalli, Lord of War, and Sun, and Tlaloc, Master of Rains and Storms. Between them empire's balance was measured, victory and harvest, drought and famine. 2 altars, 2 appetites, their hunger answered with hearts and tears lifted skyward. Processions climbed the steep stairs, bare feet slipping on worn stone. The plaza below drew tight with silence. Drums rolled across water, shells bellowed, high flutes cried, sound braided with incense, pulling the living upward toward the cold patience of knives. At the summit, the rite moved like choreography. 4 priests fixed the limbs, another forced the head back. The 5th raised obsidian thin as glass. With one sure stroke the chest opened, ribs parted, and a heart leapt into the smoky air. The hearts settled into a bowl before painted idols as incense coiled. Blood ran in shining threads along stair treads. Whitening stone turned red. The emptied body was heaved aside and tumbled, end over end, toward the upstretched hands below. Attendants descended with practised speed. Limbs severed cleanly, torsos divided and wrapped. Portions sent to nobles, others buried within sacred foundations. Skins dried for vestments, bones carved to flutes and awls, flesh simmered with maize for ritual feasts. Nothing useless, every fragment assigned. Letters home described temples crusted black with old blood, a sweetness of rot on the wind. They wrote of skull racks glaring across plazas, thousands of grinning faces. Horror filled the page, yet even condemnation faltered before such disciplined order. Centuries later, the ground answered. Excavations at Templo Mayor exposed circular towers of skulls, crania drilled and mortared into walls. In a single tower, hundreds were counted. Bone became architecture, the chronicle's darkest lines proven by stone and earth together. Night settled over the lake city. Drums tested their skins, deep cuauhxicalli voices rolling across canals. Tzompantli tones answered in wood. Copal curled from doorways. On the causeways, vendors packed away baskets. Stars gathered above the pyramid, and watchers counted them patiently. Before dawn, calendar priests opened codices painted with day signs. Tricinas turned like gears. The solar year met the sacred count. Beans clicked in bowls. Bark paper banners were marked. On the roof, a watcher waited for Venus to spear the horizon today. In the Calmacac, novices whispered chants until breath aligned. Sleep was forbidden. At first light, they pierced earlobes with maguey thorns, feeding bark paper with drops. Ash traced across cheeks. A teacher tapped time on wood, binding memory to rhythm and smoke. Pochteka gathered at their guild house, quiet as oars. Routes were recited, mountain passes, coast roads, jungle trails. Cacao packed tight, quetzal feathers wrapped, jade and copper bells hidden. Merchants were spies and lifelines both, carrying news, wealth, and obligation back to Tenochtitlan. On Chinampas, the morning opened green. Willows stitched the banks. Canoes slid between rows of maize and amaranth. Fishermen lifted nets glittering with lake light. Gardeners hoed dark soil, folding night soil under beds. First sheaves were set aside for household altars. Causeways gripped the lake with stone spines. Sluice gates controlled brackish water. From Chapultepec, the aqueduct walked in double arches, pouring clarity into basins. Sweepers cleared streets. Market judges set their mats. Cleanliness, law and water braided daily life, tighter than fear. In the ball court, rubber thudded against stone. Players wore yokes and knee guards, bodies slick with oil. The ball flew like a dark planet, skimming walls. Points mattered, but omens mattered more. The game stitched sky and earth with every strike today. At dusk, storytellers gathered on the platform. They sang flower and song, retelling Coyolxuqui's fall and the birth of Huitzilopochtli. Dancers shook ankle bells, painted shields flashed. Children leaned forward, eyes wide. Myth walked the plaza, instructing the city how to be itself tonight. Tlatelolco woke like a sea of colour. Traders unfurled mats, stacked gourds and cacao beans, counted cotton cloaks by tens. Salt cakes, obsidian blades, smoked fish, honeyed amaranth. Market judges checked measures, silence falling when their staffs tapped. Law braided through barter, noise and breath. Feather workers opened cedar chests. Hummingbird skins shimmered like spilled water. Quetzal plumes glowed green as lake reeds. fingers stitched light itself into capes and helmets. A golden beak flashed. Glue of orchid sap set mosaics that moved when dancers turned. Birds reborn from thread and patience. Stone rang in workshops where turquoise became sky on shields. Obsidian cores split to perfect knives with a flaken breath. Gold workers heated clay moulds, poured suns into bracelets and nose ornaments. Scribes ground cochineal and malachite, painting codices that folded memory into jagged, living lines. Midwives soothed labour with songs and steam. Temazcal doors shut. Water hissed on stones, herbs blooming in heat. Hands pressed the lower back. Maguey sap cooled angry skin. When the child cried, a prayer touched the hearth, and warm tortillas greeted a new mouth. Cuauhxicalli drums called youths before dawn. They ran the causeways with bundles, practiced atlatl throws at reed targets, learned to move as one body. Lessons bit like cold water, carry wood without complaint, eat after elders, speak little, mend what you break, return heavier than you left. Engineers walked the city's edges at first light. The dike held brackish water back, while aqueducts whispered clarity in twin arches. Drawbridges lifted for war canoes, fell for trade. Couriers flashed past with painted staffs, thongs knotted with counts, messages racing faster than the sun. Tribute houses breathed cedar and dust. Officials tallied cloaks, cacao, rubber balls, copper bells, jaguar skins. Glyph lists grew page by page. Warehouse doors thudded shut, seals pressed in clay. At dusk, caravans snaked outward, obligation braided into distance, the empire measured in footsteps. Evening folded the city in flowers and smoke. Women ground maize on metates, tortillas rose and sighed. Chile steamed, beans thickened in black pots. Dancers tightened ankle bells, flutes tested notes. At the household altar, copal curled upward, and grandparents unrolled the family's thread of names. Tzompantli began with sweeping brooms and hush. A chosen woman, bathed and perfumed, became Totec on earth. At dusk she died by obsidian. By dawn, a priest stepped inside her flayed skin, warm and leaking, dancing renewal, while gardeners sowed seeds streaked dark with human blood. Conquest lifted banners like sunrise. Standards cracked in the wind. Warriors painted bodies blue. On the pyramid, hearts rose in relentless rhythm, one after another, drums counting each life. Blood poured down the stairway, and the people roared, feeding the sun so it would march tomorrow. Toxcatl crowned a year of living divinity. The youth who wore Tezcatlipoca's jewels broke his flutes as he climbed, each snap a farewell. On the summit he lay calmly across stone. Obsidian opened him. When his heart lifted, the city wept and cheered together. On the Tlacaxipehualiztli, a captive faced champions. His sword was wood-edged with feathers, mock power against real obsidian. He swung bravely, was cut, rose and fell again. When he collapsed for the last time, priests took him upward, and his heart sealed the spectacle with final certainty. Arrow sacrifice pinned breath to the air. A victim bound to a frame, archers circled, loosing shafts into arms, thighs, belly. Blood pattered into bowls below, carried to fields as promise. When the chest finally stilled, farmers watched the sky for rain. Communion followed death in careful measure. Flesh simmered with maize and herbs, ladled in thimble portions, to nobles and honoured warriors. No gluttony, only ritual etiquette, a bite, a prayer, a swallow. Bones cleaned, burned or carved, leftovers buried. They believed divinity travelled mouth to mouth. Spaniards gagged at the smell before they saw it. Walls tar black with old blood. Skull towers glaring, drums rolling like thunder over water. Soldiers crossed themselves, scribes sharpened quills. In letters home, horror became argument. God wills our conquest, yet their hands shook as they wrote. A captain struck during a festival's dance. Gold flashed on wrists, then blades flashed brighter. Drums stopped mid-beat, bodies fell in heaps, bells still chiming on ankles. Afterward, the Spaniards washed the steps, raised a cross, and slept badly, hearing flutes in their dreams. Priests inside flayed skins endured days of rot. The hides stiffened, edges curling, seams weeping. Flies gathered, maggots stitched slow white lines. People reached to touch the damp garment, blessing themselves with its warmth. He moved carefully, swaying like a reborn god, breathing through his teeth. At midnight, crews washed the steps. Baskets of lime scattered, brine sloshed from gourds. Gutters ran pink into canals. Women scrubbed altar faces with fibre brushes. Boys hauled buckets. Knives were honed on wet stone until obsidian sang, ready for morning's first heart. On feast days, bowls travelled hand to hand. Clay cups of broth, thimble portions of flesh, maize thickened with herbs. Faces turned solemn, eyes lowered. A bite, a breath, a whispered name. No gluttony, only etiquette. Believing divinity crossed lips and joined their blood. Word spread that bearded captives were taken. Foreign armour laid out like shells, helmets bright as fish. On the height they were painted, garlanded, and shown to crowds. When hearts rose red in smoke, the city shouted, proof that even iron bent under obsidian and gods. A new row appeared on the skull rack. Faces pale, jaws square, whiskers stiff in the sun. Holes drilled clean through temples, cords threaded, heads aligned. At night the wind whistled between teeth. Sentries swore the rack spoke, ribs of air saying, remember. Hunger tightened during the siege. Chinampas burned, fish traps emptied, maize measured seed by seed. Still the drum sounded. Blood paid the debt when grain could not. Faint priests swayed above the crowd. Copper tasted in every mouth. The sun climbed, bought dear. Spaniards gagged, then set to work. Gold pried from masks, idols toppled, hearths melted treasure into bars. Yet the stench would not yield, sweet and iron, old and new. Chroniclers wrote salvation with shaking hands. Faith grappling with nausea, their ink could not hide. After the fall the bonfires raged. Skull towers broken, hides burned, knives buried beneath new floors. Crosses lifted where drums had stood. But in gardens at night a thorn pierced a fingertip. A drop fed the soil, and someone whispered a forgotten name. Friars rang bells over broken pyramids. Baptismal water beaded on foreheads, still smelling of copal. Drums were burned, conch shells smashed, feather suits locked away. In plazas, idols toppled into dust while soldiers stacked muskets. Salvation thundered in sermons as old prayers slipped beneath the noise. Families hid gods behind lime-plastered walls. A small mask wrapped in cotton, a jade bead in a jar. At night, a thorn bit a fingertip. A dot of blood touched corn furrows. No shouting, no drums, only breath and earth. A secret treaty with the dark. Smallpox arrived like a false dawn. Eyes filmed, blisters flowered, breath rattled short. Bodies piled faster than prayers. Pyres smoked sweet and awful. Some said the gods were angry at silence. A razor flashed in a doorway, and a hidden paper drank red. Stones from temples became steps for new houses. Masons pried open a sealed niche. A bowl of knives, dried flowers, a tiny jawbone. They stared, crossed themselves, and walled it up again. The city learned to build over teeth, leaving the bite in place. Hunger stalked even after conquest. In a shuttered room, elders ladled a thimble of flesh-dark broth to two nobles. A last forbidden communion, a whisper of the old pact. Boots crashed the door, the pot upended. Heads rolled later, prayers cut short by rope. The Spaniards punished theft with hands on hooks. They hanged rebels from beams and branded cheeks with crosses. They wrote of mercy conquering demons, of hell extinguished at last. Yet in candlelight their scribes paused, ink trembling, hearing drums that no longer beat. Centuries turned, shovels opened the earth. Out came walls of skulls mortared in circles. A child's ribs nested in shells, knives still glass sharp. Under museum glass the silence felt heavy as smoke. Tourists leaned close, then back, beauty and terror braided so tightly it cut the eyes. Night returns to the ruins. Wind fingers the reconstructed rack. A dry music answers. Somewhere, someone lights copal. The scent climbs the dark like a remembered song. Above, traffic hisses. Below, stone keeps its ledger, debits in hearts, credits in dawn. Codices began with silence and sweeping. A woman sanctified as Toti was led, perfumed and painted. Obsidian opened her throat, warm blood darkened brooms and mats. Before sunrise, a priest stepped into her flayed skin and danced, scattering freshly cut hair and seed as fields drank red water. Tzompantli effigies, gods shaped from amaranth and honey, were lifted high. Priests mixed a drop of heart blood into the dough, then broke the idols to pieces. People ate the fragments solemnly, eyes lowered. They said the deity walked their veins, moving with breath the way wind moves reeds. Nobles tasted sanctioned flesh in thimble measures, a strip seared on a hot stone, brushed with chili and herbs, passed from hand to hand. No hunger, only rite, a bite, a whisper, a swallow. Pulke touched lips afterward, sealing the vow to gods and city. On the Tlacaxipehualiztli, the captive was tethered at the waist. His sword bore feathers instead of obsidian, honour without edge. Eagle and jaguar knights struck him in turn, shields cracking, teeth pink with spit. When he fell at last, drums surged, and priests carried him upward. Arrow sacrifice fastened a victim to a wooden frame. Archers walked a circle, loosing shafts one by one, arms, thighs, belly, blood singing into bowls below. A final arrow entered beneath the ribs. Farmers lifted the brimming vessels and tipped them over seed, bargaining for rain. Xipe Totec's feast dressed streets in borrowed skin. Fresh hides were tied at wrists and ankles, faces sewn under faces. The walkers begged for gifts, blessing fields with touch. Flies followed like incense. On the 20th day, stiff skins were folded away with prayers. Spaniards climbed the temple and stopped gagging. Walls caked black with clotted layers, bowls congealed to rims. Idols wore garlands pasted with old blood. Priests' hair was matted into ropes. They crossed themselves, muttering saints' names, and counted skulls drilled through the temples. Letters sailed east describing racks of heads, like palisades. A notary scratched numbers. A captain swore the sun darkened at the smell. They called it Satan's city, yet pocketed discs of gold, kept the knives as trophies, and dreamed of stairways slick with hearts that would not stop rising. Children were washed, painted blue for Tlaloc, garlanded with paper streamers. Priests coaxed tears with masks and cold water. Tears were prayers, proof of need. On mountain shrines they were carried to springs. A quick cut, a plunge, rain bargained from the sky with small bodies. Some offerings vanished into sacred pools and caves. Bowls of blood tipped into dark mouths. Jade drops followed, then breath. Echoes counted the gifts. On the banks, women scattered maize and lifted wet hands, pleading that clouds remember their names and fields. Nobles bled themselves by choice, tongues, earlobes, thighs pierced with maguey thorns. Cords threaded through, paper soaked and burned. Pain tuned the prayer. A priest's back laced with cuts like a net. Drops pattered on bark, each spark a debt paid into dawn. Skull racks were engineered like ladders. Holes drilled clean through temples. Transverse poles slid bone to bone. Sinew lashed rows steady, lime-sealed gaps. When sun cracked them, fresh heads replaced the pale ones. Order kept with cords and counts. The wall renewing itself in faces. Hearts rarely lay bare on stone. Eagle and jaguar vessels waited, cuauhxicalli carved to swallow heat. Sometimes a chacmul reclined, belly bowl smoking. Priests tipped the heart into the mouth of the beast, and steam coiled upward as if the sun exhaled. Communion obeyed rules as sharp as knives. Portions no larger than a thumb's width served to rank alone. Common mouths forbidden. Chili and herbs masked nothing. A bite, a breath, a name spoken. To eat without rite was theft from gods. punished like treason. Spaniards hacked at the racks, skulls thudding like gourds. Counts were argued in camp by lamplight, hundreds, thousands. Men crossed themselves, then dreamed of stairs slick with red. In letters they swore Satan ruled this city, even as they kept an obsidian knife for home. Cosmos pressed at the edges when rituals faltered. Old women whispered of tsitsi mime, star demons gnawing the world if hearts stopped rising. Priests cut their own ears and fed bark to flames. Cannons answered with iron thunder. Night held both musket smoke and drums no one could silence. Nobles bled themselves where it hurt most. Thorns slid through foreskin and tongue. Cords threaded, paper drank the drops. Pain was a metronome for prayer. Ash smeared across cuts, the papers burned. Smoke carried iron taste skyward, and lips trembled with words nobody dared speak aloud. Caravans climbed to Mount Tlaloc in cold breath. Children painted blue were wrapped in cloaks, bells tied to wrists. Mothers sang so hands would not shake. At the spring, priests lowered small bodies and called the clouds. When wind answered, women sobbed into their veils. In precinct shade, a skin was prepared for wearing. Grease rubbed the inside, holes stitched at wrists and ankles. A priest stepped in slowly, face disappearing beneath another's face. Flies rose like incense. He moved among seed baskets, blessing fields with touch that left damp prints. The gladiatorial stone turned slowly red. A captive tethered at the waist swung his feather-edged sword, breath raw. Eagle and jaguar knights struck in measured turns, shin, ribs, mouth. He sagged, laughed once and toppled. On the steps above, a drum rolled him the rest of the way. Communion followed with rules like knives, portions no wider than a thumb, lifted in jade or clay. No salt, no second helping, no laughter. A bite, a breath, a name spoken. Chile stung the eyes, nobody wiped tears. Divinity was swallowed as carefully as fire. A friar climbed the stairs and froze. He saw painted knives laid in a fan, hearts steaming in bowls shaped like beasts. A priest's mouth moved against a vessel rim as if drinking heat. That night the friar wrote by candle, spelling hell with a trembling hand. During the last hunger, the city ate memory. Strips cut from the dead were rendered to tallow. Shields scraped clean. Still the drum sounded. A bearded prisoner screamed as his head met stone. His helmet clanged down the steps like a bell that would not stop ringing. On the final morning, idols went down in ropes, skulls thudded from their racks, poles snapped like dry reeds. But on a rooftop, a woman pierced her ear and let one drop fall. She touched it to a pot of seed and whispered, "Rise even if we do not." Night crews tended the skull rack. Fresh heads drilled clean through temples, slid onto poles with wet knocks. Old bone, sun-paled and brittle, was taken down to lime pits. A priest counted softly, bead by bead. The rack faced the city like a calendar of faces. When flayed skins stiffened, sellers received them. Bundles tied at wrists and ankles, hair still threaded with flowers. The room was cool, damp, and humming with flies. A prayer sealed the door. Earth learned a new smell, salt, copper, and the sweet of rot. A captive rose the stairs as if through water. Incense burned the throat. Drums pressed the ribs from inside. Sky narrowed to a blade, black as pooled night. He saw the priest's eyes steady as stone. Below, thousands leaned forward and forgot to breathe. Horses terrified the city, monsters of two bodies. When one finally lay broken, its head was sawn free with obsidian. Children touched the teeth, warriors spat and laughed. Its skull joined the rack for a day, then vanished. In camp, Spaniards crossed themselves until knuckles blanched. Skinwalkers moved through the market in daylight. Merchants pressed cacao into their hands for luck. Farmers begged blessing for seed. Where the damp cloth touched, people shivered. A child reached, then cried. The priest nodded once, as if listening to a god inside the hide. On feast nights, the city bled itself together. Tongues and ears pierced in unison, cords pulled through with hissed prayers. Bark paper blotted dark, and was burned in baskets. The smoke rose in columns, thin red ledgers sent upward to balance the sun. Women dead in childbirth were honoured like slain warriors. Their spirits haunted crossroads at dusk, faces painted with bones. Men avoided those corners, clutching amulets tight. If wind lifted hair from the nape, someone murmured a name. Even Spaniards gave the junctions a wider turn. Before the strangers came, omens stacked like jars. A temple burned without flame, a comet scratched the sky, water in the lake boiled, an eagle held mirror metal in its claws. Hearts rose faster on the pyramid. Moctezuma stared at the east and slept less each night. Moctezuma met the strangers on a causeway of flowers. Gifts glittered, gold discs, feather capes, chocolate in foaming cups. Below the great temple, the steps were still brown-black. Spaniards smiled, gagging at the smell. Priests smiled, hands clean from fasting, knives sleeping in their cotton wraps. Toxcatl's dance turned to screaming metal. Shell bells chimed on ankles, then were drowned by blades. Drums stopped mid-beat, the plaza filled with bodies. By night the whitened steps ran pink again, and a wind moved through feather piles, as if something breathed there. On La Noche Triste the lake heard prayers in 2 languages. Spaniards fleeing on causeways looked back and saw fires on the pyramid. Comrades were painted, raised, opened, hearts lifted toward the stars. Drums rolled like surf, armour glinted, helmets tumbled shining down the stairs. Morning brought heads displayed to break will. Beards stiff with dried blood, eyes filmed, mouths open on final words. Messengers carried the news to allies. Some cheered, some crossed themselves. Inside the precinct, priests washed stone and ground red pigment with blood to repaint weary gods. Auto-sacrifice stitched the days between captures. Stingray spines slid through tongues. Cords dragged until breath hitched. Paper drank the drops and burned to sweet smoke. A scribe touched the ash to a page and wrote a god's name, steadying his hand with a taste of iron. When the city fell, Spanish justice bit back. Lords were burned alive, others hanged. Cuauhxicalli lay bound while oil boiled. His feet hissed where they pressed the ladle. He did not plead. A friar watched, sweating, and later wrote, "Mercy," the words sticking in his teeth. Gold anchored the drowned. Bars clanked in sacks. Men slipped from narrow causeways into black water. Bodies were dragged up days later, green with weed, fingers clawed. A child pried a glittering coin from a palm and ran. The lake closed over the story. Under the new cathedral, masons unearthed a circle of jaws. They stacked them quietly and built the floor. At mass the bells rang. Dust trembled from the vaults. A soldier fingered an obsidian knife he kept hidden and felt briefly the old drums under the hymn. An eclipse bled the noon sky. Faces smeared black. Children hidden under mats. Pregnant women watched, so star demons wouldn't steal their bellies. Priests cut their ears and fed bark to fire. When the light faltered, hearts rose faster, thrown skyward like sparks to relight the sun. At Cholula, the temple doors were shut from outside. Conches tried to warn, then steel answered. Fire ran along reed roofs, smoke trapped the breath. Bodies piled in courtyards, bells still chimed on ankles. By dusk the plaza steamed, and the Spaniards prayed in armour. Moctezuma faced his people on the roof. Stones leapt from the crowd like hot hail. Some said Spaniards killed him later. Others swore his own struck true. Either way, he fell heavy, smeared with flowers and dust, and the city howled like a broken drum. In the square, an auto-da-fe bloomed in flame. Bound men and women lifted their chins into smoke. A friar preached salvation over the roar. A scribe looked away. Far off a shell trumpet sounded once from a rooftop, then stopped as the fire found bone. War dogs hit like iron with teeth. Leather collars studded, jaws red. They drove people from alleys into pikes. A woman held up a child. The animal leapt through both. Spaniards called the beasts instruments of God and wiped their blades clean with shaking hands. Cuauhxicalli died far from the lake. A jungle road, a hurried gallows, a king's feet already scarred by oil. He asked for the knife, got rope instead. Leaves closed over the sound. A soldier signed the cross and dreamed of drums until he drank himself quiet. Years later, a cave lay warm with hidden breath. 2 men bled a captive by torchlight, hearts thudding in bowls shaped like beasts. Boots crashed the stones, shots barked, flames licked hair. By morning the bodies hung in the plaza, and the bowls lay cracked in dust. Sentries turned and shovels worked. From a pit came foreign skulls drilled clean through the temples, beards traced in lime. Notes read, Spaniards, likely festival captives. Tourists pressed lips thin. A child counted the holes aloud. Above, traffic hissed. Below, the ledger of faces kept adding. Barbers laid out obsidian flakes beside baskets. Captives' hair was cut in locks, tied with paper, dabbed with blood, and piled like small black birds. Women clipped their braids for luck. At dawn the bundles burned, and smoke carried the names upward like thin, dark ropes. Before sacrifice, priests purged in temazcales. Steam roared, herbs stung, bellies emptied until bile shone green on stone. They scraped tongues with thorns, spat iron taste, then stepped barefoot onto chill flagstones. Hollow as drums, they lifted knives and felt nothing but the weight of duty. Obsidian blades had lives. Named, wrapped in cotton, they slept in reed sheaths. When edges tired, priests snapped them deliberately and buried the shards with flowers and paper. Years later, Spaniards found caches, broken night glass glittering like frost, each splinter still sharper than confession. Captives sometimes sang on the stairs. Flower songs traded breath for beauty. Make me a path of petals, let my blood shine like dew. Crowd stilled, listening. When the heart lifted, the last note hung a moment, bright, clean, before the drum swallowed it whole. Xipe's skins were treated like fields. Hides rinsed in cold water, smeared with fat, dusted with axiote until they gleamed yellow. A priest's hand, still damp, pressed seed baskets. Farmers shivered at the touch. Later, the skins dried stiff as bark and were folded with prayers. A friar begged to bury the dead. A captain ordered pyres. Gold hissed in crucibles, bone cracked in heat. They argued under black smoke, mercy versus victory, while flies wrote circles in the air. By night both men dreamed the same dream. Steps, hearts, and breathing stone. Death whistles hunted sleep. A patrol heard that jagged shriek and broke ranks. Horses backed, eyes rolling. One soldier dropped to his knees, swearing the sound came from inside his ribs. In the morning he asked for transfer, saying only, "The air here has teeth." Blood never ran wild. Channels cut into basalt led it neatly to bowls. Gutters sloped true, masons' plumb lines stained red. Attendants ladled from basins to repaint idols, tracing old grooves with fresh shine. Even the flow obeyed rules. Order held the horror in place. Captives knelt in a line while painters worked. Blue bands crossed mouths, black stepped lines climbed cheekbones. A priest pressed a feather to each chest and listened. Behind him a boy carried cotton wraps for hearts. Someone gagged, someone prayed, drums practiced a slow heartbeat in the dark. Flayed dancers crossed thresholds to bless the season. Door lintels smeared, cradles tapped twice with damp hands. Mothers hid babies under shawls. Fathers looked at the floor. A wet print bloomed on each mat. When they left, flies remained, stitching the air with a living thread. Skin suits were sewn shut like clothing. Bone needles bit, sinew thread tugged wrists to ankles, lips over lips. Eye holes stared from behind another face. Children watched through fingers. Outside, a basket caught drips. Inside, a priest whispered the word for renew. The skullmen worked with reeds and lime. Drills whirred through temples, hooks pulled brain, knives shaved scalp. Heads bathed, then hung to dry from cords. Tomorrow they would slide onto poles with a wet click, new rungs on a ladder of faces. A bonfire of books blazed in the plaza. Painted pages curled, Flowers, gods, calendars turned to black lace. A translator was made to speak each picture aloud, then flogged for knowing them. Wax popped, glue stank. A friar wept quietly and called the tears victory. Meat was measured like vows. A runner brought cacao to tally portions. Tongs lifted strips no wider than a thumb. Clay bowls travelled in a solemn circle, bite, breath, name. Afterward, the bones were singed clean and rattled once, then buried where the stone remembered. Grave pits were opened for gold, idols hacked for inlays, jawbones rolled into dust. That night a courtyard saw 3 candles, a thorn, a bowl. An old man bled into water and poured it on seed. He slept well for the first time in years. A notary counted heads at the rack. He muttered numbers, lost them, began again. Scribes scratched, soldiers crossed themselves. Priests stood like stone. By sundown, the count became a rumour with wings, flying east as a number no one would forget. Priests spoke to the lifted heart as if it could still hear. They pressed it to a cuauhxicalli carved like an eagle, wings outspread. Steam rose, incense braided with iron heat. They smeared a thumb across their own lips, tasting sun, and set the heart down gently. Processions carried bowls along marked routes. Attendants dipped brushes of stiff fibre and repainted idol mouths until they shone wet. A priest flicked drops toward the crowd. Children flinched. Mothers wiped cheeks with shawls, eyes lowered, accepting a blessing that stung like salt. Flaying began with a collar cut at the chest. Skin loosened with hand and knife, peeled slow as bark in spring. Inside was heat and breath and shaking. Later, a novice stepped into the hide, face swallowed by another face, and walked where seed waited. Drums bullied the lake wind before battle. Death whistles knifed the horses' nerves. Lances wobbled. War canoes slammed the causeway ladders. Captives were dragged, blue-painted hands tight on wrists. Above, the steps cleared like a mouth. It would eat quickly if the gods approved. Molten gold hissed where priests' hair had matted. Idols toppled in ropes, faces splintering on stone. A soldier lifted a knife, sliced his finger by accident, and sucked the cut. He spat immediately, crossed himself twice, and still dreamed red for weeks. Skins cured badly when the air turned wet. Mould threaded the seams. A sweet, sick smell woke men from sleep. Priests rubbed fat into the hides and sprinkled Archaeology for colour. On the 20th day, they folded them shut, flies buzzing like beads. On the rack, a transverse beam cracked under weight. Skulls slid, clacked, and spilled teeth like hail. Men shouted, lifting faces back into rows. Cords tugged tight through old holes. Lime paste sealed the split. The wall resumed its stare without apology. A notary held an obsidian flake to the light. It disappeared at the edge. Then it wasn't there. Then it was, drinking brightness. He drew it across parchment and felt nothing, only a line of cut. That night he wrote innumerable heads and meant the word literally. Lines of captives wound around the precinct all day. Priests rotated in teams, wash, fast, cut, pray, hands cramping, shoulders black with dried incense. Blood gutters whispered along the stairs. A steward tapped a tally board with bone. Drums never paused. The sun crossed a red geometry of stone. By dusk the knives shivered in basins. Novices fetched fresh obsidian blades. From cotton wraps, edges invisible until they bit. Veterans flexed numb fingers, then lifted another chest to the light. A runner brought salt and lime for the steps. The crowd answered with one vast breath. Night fed the flies until they became weather. Temple lamps hissed, copal thickened the air. Dogs nosed the lowest treads and were struck away. Attendants pushed clots aside with reeds, sluiced channels clear. A priest wept once quietly, then steadied and cut again. At first light the plaza shone wet and new. Women covered children's eyes, then looked themselves. Vendors returned with tamales and water gourds, business stitched through terror. A conch called, banners snapped. Another line moved, bare feet slapping stone where red still pulled in seams. Cookhouses multiplied their fires. Great pots thickened with maize and herb. A strip of sanctioned flesh hissed, divided in thimble portions. Nobles took their bites without speaking. A young lord retched, swallowed it back, and nodded. Portions were tallied like debts and closed with pulque. Allies watching from shadow counted hearts by drumbeat. A Tlacaxipehualiztli messenger gripped a post until splinters entered his palm. That night, he prayed to a different saint and sharpened his obsidian anyway. In camp, the story grew teeth, racks like palisades, steps like mouths, a city that ate. Builders strengthened the skull wall's footings. Lime paste sealed uprights. New crossbeams drank rope and creaked. Fresh faces slid into rows, while older bone whitened to paper. When the sun tilted, eye holes filled with light. The plaza flinched as if the wall had blinked. Deep pits opened behind the temple. Bones nested carefully, long with long, small with small, each layer dusted with ash and prayer. A jade bead, a shell, a rubber ball tucked among ribs. Earth folded shut and held its breath. Above, drums rolled on like weather. Cuauhxicalli blows opened flesh like doors. Obsidian teeth chewed skin to ribbons without killing. Tendons parted at wrists and ankles so captives dropped their weapons alive. Blue paint slicked their bodies, paper garlands shook. Hands bound with Maggie cord, they walked home leaking, already spoken for by stone. On the steps the sky shrank to a blade. Incense stung the throat. Drums climbed the ribs. 4 hands pinned, 1 hand tilted the chin. The knife slid once, cold, then hot, 3 breaths long. A red weight lifted, steaming in air that tasted of metal and smoke. Blood was saved for later as well as now. Basins settled overnight. Skins formed, dried, stacked like dark wafers. Ground to paste with cochineal and hematite, they fed murals and idols months afterward. Old shine was renewed with old blood. Horror preserved as pigment and proof. Communion moved in a circle without chatter. Clay spoons carried stew thick with maize. Sanctioned meat appeared in thumb-small morsels. A steward noted each serving with cacao counters. Lips touched, swallowed, lowered. Leftovers were burned or buried, bowls washed with ash. The room smelled of herbs and iron. A bearded deserter was caught outside the walls. Painted, garlanded, led up in silence, he recognised a comrade's helmet on the rack. When his heart rose, the plaza roared. By night his head stared from the poles. In the Spanish camp, men prayed and did not sleep. Teeth were strung as warnings and music. Necklaces clicked on dancers' chests. Wrist rattles hissed when arms cut the air. Jawbones laced with reeds became clappers. Children counted holes with their fingers and stopped at the broken ones, as if the numbers could bite. Knives lived by rules, edges rinsed in brine, dried, wrapped. When they dulled, priests snapped them, buried shards with flowers and paper. Novices learned to feel keenness with a thumbnail, not sight. A good edge vanished when you stared at it. Only the cut proved it was there. At dusk, a tally board showed today's debt. Grooves cut with bone pins marked hearts taken. Cords knotted with counts looped a steward's wrist. A notary scratched innumerable and stopped, hearing drums that had already ended. The stair treads cooled, but the stone kept its heat. Tzompantli loosened the border of fear. Priests chewed bitter caps and rolled songs in their mouths. The chosen drank pulque in thin bowls. Faces shone, patterns braided the air. When the drums struck, courage rose like heat. The stairs moved under bare feet, and no one looked back. Calendars ruled the knife. A day sign opened and closed the chest. Reed, flint, movement. Omens balanced like bowls. A watcher read Venus in the east. If clouds smothered the star, the rite paused. When it burned clear above the lake, the conch called and cutting began. Mats were laid in measured rows. Reed brooms herded blood to gutters. Lime turned shine to scum. Novices passed basins, learned joints by feel. Wrist first, then elbow, not bone, but ligaments. A master tapped their knuckles. Cut where things want to part. Make the body agree. The pyramid was tuned for sound. Cuauhxicalli boomed into stone, bounced back as thunder. Tzompantli answered in hard wooden syllables. Echoes caged the plaza. Horses in the camp below sidestepped, eyes rolling. When death whistles shrieked, men swore the air itself grew claws and clutched the chest. Hearts cooled properly, or not at all. Set too late, and steam died. Set right, and vessels pulsed once more in the bowl. A priest watched for tremor in the surface, omen of acceptance. If it stilled too fast, he cut his own ear and fed it heat. Spaniards stabled horses in a temple court. Manure steamed where incense had burned. Idols lay face down under hooves. At night, a trooper woke gagging, sweet iron and dung braided tight. He dragged the beasts outside and crossed himself, and would not sleep again within those walls. A drummer's hands split and bled. He wrapped them in bark and kept time. The city's breath depended on his beat. When the knife slipped in rain and a heart fell heavy, he struck once, harder, and the crowd roared as if he had caught it in the air. Years later, a disk of a dismembered goddess rose from earth. Cranes groaned. Mud glittered on stone thighs. A painted smile woke in daylight. People crowded the fence and went quiet. A worker wiped his brow, streaked red with clay, and whispered. She was always here, waiting. Priests ground ololiuqui seeds and strong tobacco into a bitter drink. Victims sipped from gourd cups. Breath slowed, eyes filmed with patterns. A hand on the shoulder steadied each step. Drums unfurled like a road. When the knife appeared, no one flinched, only the city inhaled. At equinox, the watcher raised a reed. The rising sun slid between temple corners. A heart lifted into its light. Steam haloed red around the disc. The crowd groaned as if a weight shifted. For a moment the world held steady, balanced on a pulse. Diviners darkened a room and lit a single lamp. An obsidian mirror drank the flame until only faces swam in night glass. A priest flicked blood across it with paper strips. Images came, signs, dates, a chosen name. Outside, runners left at once to fetch him. A palace stew steamed in painted bowls. Hominy burst like white blossoms. Chiles hissed in fat. In rumour, a thimble of sanctioned flesh lay among kernels. An emperor's private communion. Spaniards wrote the story down with shaking hands. Nobles called it a lie and kept eating. Idols wore skins as garments. Fresh hide pressed over stone shoulders, tied at wrists and throat. Blood ran down carven ribs into basins. Flowers stuck where it clotted. Priests sang the god awake inside his borrowed body. At dusk they peeled it back and folded it with care. A bearded prisoner saw his own heart. He watched hands lift it, the colour wrong in evening light, and heard the plaza roar like surf. His comrades on the causeway broke and ran. Later they swore they had seen the sun dim. Scribes mixed pigment on stone. Cochineal like crushed velvet, hematite grit, soot for night. A drop of heart blood brightened the red. A brush traced jaws and banners on bark paper. The page dried stiff as a scab. History closed, sticky at the edges. Afterward came a hush. Knives slept in cotton. Basins skinned over and were lifted away. The priest lay on cool stone and listened to flies, hands still trembling like struck bells. Below, the plaza exhaled and began to sweep. Priests lay their knives to sleep and wash in bowls that pinken. Their hands tremble, incense hides little. One hears drums still when none are beating, another tastes iron in water. They bind cut fingers with paper, lie awake till dawn, and rise when the conch demands it. A night patrol crosses the precinct and freezes. Death whistles rip the air. Horses sit back, rolling eyes, foam stringing their bits. Men curse in 3 languages. Someone drops a torch. Shadows jerk like dancers. Later, the letter home says only, "The wind here has teeth." Behind the temple, pits open like dark mouths. Long bones nest with long, small with small. Ribs ring bowls of jade and shell. A child's bead bracelet glints among vertebrae. Ash dusts each layer. The earth closes carefully, as if arranging a sleeping room. Banners drink blood in measured passes. Attendants stroke fibre brushes along war standards until stitched eagles shine. Drains gurgle. Lime sours the air. A novice carries a basin too full. It slaps his shins warm. He doesn't wipe it, just walks, jaw clenched, counting steps. A friar, led blindfold through the precinct, stumbles on clots. He smells sweetness gone wrong, hears a wet thump, feels heat on his cheek. The cloth comes off. Bowls, knives, painted mouths. That night he writes "Miracle" by candlelight, then scrubs his beard to kill the scent. Canoes move under moonlight like insects on glass. Bodies wrapped in mats lie between baskets of flowers. Copal sparks drift and die. At the island shrine, flames lean in lake wind. Ash falls with petals on black water. Cormorants dive through red rings and rise, blinking. In a courtyard, a hide dries on a wooden frame. Holes laced tight at wrists and ankles. Axiote gleams in seams. Mothers bring seed baskets for blessing, then pull children back fast. Flies settle and lift in waves. By dusk the skin has learned to hold its shape. On the last night a priest dies sitting up. Assistants bind his hair with marigolds, lay obsidian shards like stars around his knees. They wash his hands that would not stop shaking. Outside the plaza sweeps. Inside, a bowl cools under his chin, skinning over as if with sleep. A scribe glued his last pages into a wall. He pricked his tongue with a thorn, pressed a red dot onto the margin, and folded the codex shut. Outside, books burned. Inside, lime crusted over paint and blood together, and the voices went to sleep in stone. A ship's hold clinked with skulls and knives. Racks were sketched for princes. A death whistle shrieked in a courtier's hand, and he dropped it, white as salt. Cabinets of curiosity bloomed in candlelight. Palaces learning the shape of terror by touch, then praying twice before bed. In the last famine, sanctioned meat vanished into rumour. A pot steamed behind a barred door. A thimble passed, eyes down. The taste was iron and chili. In the plaza a friar thundered against cannibals. A boy licked his lip and did not know why. A priest buried his knives at dawn. Cotton wraps, 3 obsidian flakes, a stingray spine, a jar of cochineal. All lowered into damp soil with a prayer. By noon he stood in a crowd as idols fell. His hands shook in his sleeves, remembering where the blades slept. Floods punched through old foundations. A skull rolled from a wall and bobbed like a gourd. Teeth clicked against stone. Workers backed away, then fetched baskets. They stacked faces quietly and went on. Rain filled the hole until water stared up with empty eyes. Under the cathedral, a mason lost his rosary. It slid into a hollow full of small bones and would not come back. He crossed himself, left it, and plastered the gap. At Mass he heard drums under the hymn and sang louder until the feeling passed. Tourists filed past a heart knife in glass. Fingerprints bloomed and were wiped. A guide said, "Obsidian," and people nodded. One woman swayed, tasting metal she had not eaten. Outside, marigolds burned in buckets. Inside, the edge drank the light and did not give it back. But what have Spanish done to the Aztecs? Soldiers broke idols with poles, toppled the great temple stones, and salted the precincts with lime. Gold went to crucibles, copper to nails for new doors. Friars burned codices in towers of paper flame. A city built on hearts was paved over with hymns and muskets. Encomenderos tallied bodies like taxes. Villages delivered cotton cloaks, maize, days of labour, and girls for service. Backs were branded, runaways hunted with dogs. A clerk wrote "Merced" beside the list, mercy, and added 2 more columns for fines and lashes. Mines swallowed lungs. Men dragged ore through tunnels where air went thin. Candles guttered. Voices scraped. Mercury burned mouths and sleep. Silver stained hands black. A priest on payday sprinkled water and said the wage was just. Men coughed blood and went back under. Reductions emptied the land. Families were marched to new grid towns. Old shrines pulled down. Graves left to flood. Fields went fallow. Chinampas rotted into reeds. A bell replaced the conch. At night, elders walked the causeways and spoke to water that no longer answered. Punishments taught the new law. Hands cut for theft, tongues bored for idolatry, stakes raised for rebels. A gallows shadowed the market. Notaries inked names, soldiers held ropes, friars murmured prayers. Wind turned pages while bodies turned in the sun. Epidemics returned like harvests. Boils flowered, skin cracked, breath rattled, pits filled. A village counted 10 souls, where once there were 100. A friar wrote God's scourge in his book and closed it on a fly. Mothers carved names into beams with a knife. Tithes and tribute braided tight. Maize, cacao, cotton and coin walked to storehouses. Debts grew legs. Those who could not pay gave days, then years. A man pawned his milper and woke a servant. The deed said forever in a hand that did not shake. Baptism made records, not rest. Statues hid behind plaster. Blood-fed paper turned to ash. A boy learned the creed in Nahuatl and dug a priest's garden. On All Souls' Night, his grandmother pricked her ear and touched seed with a drop, just in case the old gods still counted. Obrages swallowed skins and time. Windows barred, looms thundered, boys bled from fingertips, lashes striped backs for knots, and missed quotas. A foreman weighed cloth and men alike. Debt lengthened like shadows. At night they slept on the floor, among burrs of wool and the taste of dust. Idolatry hunters climbed into high villages with lists. They cracked family altars, sifted ashes for thorns and paper-stained brown red. Women hid masks in maize bins. Men swallowed tiny beads. Confession followed the lash. A bonfire ate a century of prayers in an hour. Baptism renamed the city. Juan where once was Huitzil, Maria where once was flower. A clerk inked saints over gods. A bell mapped the hours. Yet behind fresh plaster, a small face waited. On nights without the moon, someone fed it a thread of blood. Land moved under pens, markers shifted, canals assigned, chinampas fenced with words. A man signed with a cross and learned he'd sold his field. He came back with a gourd of seed and found a wall. The paper said forever, and the wall agreed. Courts traded lash for Latin. Witnesses spoke Nahuatl. Sentences answered in Spanish. A translator chose between 2 wrong words and shrugged. Fines replaced ears, ropes replaced knives. The gallows learned the plaza's wind, and the wind learned how to swing a man gently. Dogs learned new work, no longer chasing captives to altars. They hunted runaways for tribute. They dragged shoulders raw, jaws busy at calves. Spaniards called them justice. Old women spat and named each dog after a dead god, just to make the prayer sting. A friar broke a man's thorn bundle and kept one. At night he pricked his own thumb and watched the dots shine. He said a foreign prayer and almost said another. By morning he preached hell with a hoarse voice, and no one asked why his sleeve was bloody. Stones forgot slowly. Cathedral steps wore smooth with knees where knives once worked. Under the choir, a buried stair sweated in rainy seasons. Sometimes a thin red line crawled from the wall and vanished. A sexton wiped it with salt and did not look up. Obrages swallowed skins and time. Windows barred, looms thundered, boys bled from fingertips, lashes striped backs for knots, and missed quotas. A foreman weighed cloth and men alike. Debt lengthened like shadows. At night they slept on the floor, among burrs of wool and the taste of dust. Idolatry hunters climbed into high villages with lists. They cracked family altars, sifted ashes for thorns and paper-stained brown red. Women hid masks in maize bins. Men swallowed tiny beads. Confession followed the lash. A bonfire ate a century of prayers in an hour. Baptism renamed the city. Juan where once was Huitzil, Maria where once was flower. A clerk inked saints over gods. A bell mapped the hours. Yet behind fresh plaster, a small face waited. On nights without the moon, someone fed it a thread of blood. Land moved under pens, markers shifted, canals assigned, chinampas fenced with words. A man signed with a cross and learned he'd sold his field. He came back with a gourd of seed and found a wall. The paper said forever, and the wall agreed. Courts traded lash for Latin. Witnesses spoke Nahuatl. Sentences answered in Spanish. A translator chose between two wrong words and shrugged. Fines replaced ears, ropes replaced knives. The gallows learned the plaza's wind, and the wind learned how to swing a man gently. Dogs learned new work. No longer chasing captives to altars, they hunted runaways for tribute. They dragged shoulders raw, jaws busy at calves. Spaniards called them justice. Old women spat and named each dog after a dead god, just to make the prayer sting. A friar broke a man's thorn bundle and kept one. At night he pricked his own thumb and watched the dot shine. He said a foreign prayer and almost said another. By morning he preached hell with a hoarse voice, and no one asked why his sleeve was bloody. Stones forgot slowly. Cathedral steps wore smooth, with knees where knives once worked. Under the choir, a buried stair sweated in rainy seasons. Sometimes, a thin red line crawled from the wall and vanished. A sexton wiped it with salt and did not look up. The true history has been hidden. Curriculums prefer clean lines and heroes. Messy truths snarl the plot. Blood stains the page. So lessons smooth stone with lotion words. Civilization. Discovery. Progress. Horror is footnoted or timed out. Children learn maps and dates. The smell of history is kept outside the door. Patriotic stories need mirrors, not windows. Nations stare into shining versions of themselves and call it virtue. Cholula and Toxcatl bruise the reflection. So textbooks tilt the glass, saints in front, racks behind. Heroic conquest takes the light. The piles of bodies stand in shadow. Gatekeepers call it age-appropriate. They fear nightmares, complaints, careers unthreading in parent meetings. Better a softened paragraph than a hard conversation. Knives become rituals, screams become chants, towers of skulls become architectural displays. Truth is thinned to syrup, served in careful teaspoons. Time is the sharpest censor. A year sprints through empires. Exams demand names, not reasons. Teachers triage. Canals, markets, calendars. Yes, death whistles and flaying. Another day. Standards test what fits a bubble. The unspeakable refuses multiple choice and is left in the margins. Archives hide in other tongues. Nahua voices sit in brittle pages. Florentine ink needs patient eyes. Translators choose between two wrong words and wince. What survives is what someone saved. What's missing is loudest. Ash where books were, silence where women spoke. Comfort edits both sides. Conquerors rename murder mercy. Conquered rename cannibal bites communion only as myth. Each tale polishes its own blade. Education inherits the shine. We teach a seesaw of virtue and vice, and skip the weight dangling off both ends. Institutions move like stone. Publishers fear bans, ministries fear headlines, museums fear donors. Curriculums calcify, reforms chip and stop. Sanitization is safer in cells. So children visit ruins bright with labels, context without consequence, while bones underfoot keep their heavier syllabus. Teach the whole weather. Flowers and markets, yes, but also racks, knives, dogs, plague, and lies. Not to wallow, but to grow a spine that can hold truth. Let bones and books speak together. Then memory becomes compass, not wound, and history can breathe honestly. Textbooks favour clear stories and national pride. Bloody details complicate heroes, undermine simple morals, and invite controversy. Editors trim what sparks backlash. Curriculum standards reward safe summaries. Result? Students get a cleaned up past that is easier to test and defend, not necessarily true. gatekeepers cite age appropriateness. Administrators and parents worry about trauma, complaints, and politics. So teachers avoid graphic content even when it matters. Violence is renamed with soft terms. Students learn vocabulary and timelines, but not the human cost that those words conceal. Time and testing shape content. Courses sprint through centuries. Exams prize names and dates. Complex systems, war, disease, labour coercion, need time that classes don't have. Teachers triage. Shocking episodes become side notes, not because they're unimportant, but because they don't fit the schedule. Sources are hard and uneven. Indigenous accounts sit in old languages or translations with bias. Archaeology is technical and cautious. Some records were burned. When evidence is scattered or sensitive, textbooks default to generic lines that won't be challenged, and nuance disappears. Institutions avoid risk. Publishers fear bans. Ministries fear headlines. Museums fear donors. Contested history attracts pressure campaigns. Sanitized material keeps budgets safe. The incentive is to smooth edges, not to confront them, especially where religion, identity, or national myths are involved. Both sides edited the record. Conquerors framed atrocities as salvation. The conquered framed taboos within sacred logic. If schools present only one frame, students inherit propaganda. Balanced teaching requires showing the rhetoric and the evidence side by side, and letting students evaluate claims. What to teach instead? The full picture, with sources. Show codices, digs, court records, and letters. Name festivals, methods, numbers, and limits of evidence. Compare with European violence of the same era. Make space for questions. Clarity, not sensationalism. Honesty, not comfort. Colon students deserve accuracy over myth. Teach achievements and brutality together, with context and citations. Not to shock for its own sake, but to build judgment and empathy. If history includes what hurts to read, it can finally explain why people did what they did.